Good day and welcome back to the Ottawa History Hub podcast. In our last episode, John By was born in Lambeth in London town and died in nearby Front in Kent. For anyone who would insist that they're not nearby, Front is an hour-and-a-half drive from Lambeth Centre, which by Canadian standards is practically next door. Between those two events, he lived a full life of triumphs and tragedies, including spending 6 years working on the largest civil engineering project in the Americas to that date, the Rideau Canal, connecting the Great Lakes to Montreal without the need to congest the Saint Laurence River along the border with the unpredictable United States. The War of 1812, so named because it lasted until 1814, had proven the need to have an alternate route to the ocean. Lake Superior and Lake Michigan flow into Lake Huron. The Huron can connect via Detroit to Lake Erie, though the British would connect Lakes Erie and Huron to Lake Ontario through canals and portages, avoiding the Detroit chokepoint. All that land, those burgeoning towns that would become the cities of the future, Thunder Bay, Orillia, Six Nations, Toronto, Belleville, Burlington, Brantford, Kingston, and Brockville on the Canadian side, Detroit, Chicago, Green Bay, Toledo, Cleveland, and Buffalo on the American shores, all connected to the sea through the narrow and rough waters of the St. Lawrence. During the war, the American naval presence in the northeast corner of Lake Ontario effectively closed the door of the St. Lawrence to British reinforcements and support. The largest settlement in that corner of the lake was the Loyalist fortress of Kingston, which had been undergoing numerous reinforcings since the end of the war. Protected by Wolfe and Simcoe Islands, a British naval force and land command, it was no longer a vulnerable spot on the border, but a bastion of English military might in the interior. In the event of another war, a distinct possibility in the 19th century, Kingston and the St. Lawrence would likely be a flashpoint and central to a renewed conflict. Parliament made funds available for the construction of a canal, or more accurately, a series of canals, dams, and fortified locks that would run from the hopefully impregnable fortress of Kingston north along the Cataraqui River to the high point of the Rideau Lakes at Newborough, and then down the other side along the Rideau until it met the Ottawa River just east of the New Columbia settlement in Hull Township, Lower Canada. From there, ships could travel the Ottawa to Montreal and be transferred to new vessels into the seven seas and all the lands beyond them. As I pointed out earlier, the canal was not one canal but a series of canals, lakes, and rivers, and most importantly, locks. Of the 200 kilometers of what we call the Rideau system, only 30 kilometers are actual canals made by the hands of humanity, and the remaining 170 sculpted by nature. The stretch in what's now Ottawa is definitely a canal, but outside of the terminal ends of Ottawa and Kingston, much of the waterway was worked by the hand of God, rather than the many hands of the sickly Irish laborers fleeing the collapse of the Hibernian textile industry and finding construction work abroad. I'm sure that we've all heard the myth that Christopher Columbus imagined the world as being round when conventional wisdom called it flat. Pythagoras figured this out 1,800 years before then. Everyone knew the world was round. Flat Earth theory is a very modern form of silliness, propelled by online contrarianism. Of course, the Earth is not round, the Earth is not flat. Like everyone that gets on in years, the Earth is irregular and bumpy. I see you, Gaia. Speaking of Pythagoras, at the Newborough Isthmus at the south end of Greater Rideau Lake, it's approximately 200 meters above sea level. From this high point, water flows 50 kilometers southward to Kingston, but also gradually drops 125 meters in elevation to Kingston 75 meters above sea level. To the north, water flows 118 kilometers overland to the Ottawa River, but it also drops 130 meters to Ottawa's 70 meters above sea level. I'll leave you to calculate the hypotenuses as you recall grade 7 maths. The Rideau Canal is not just a north-south thoroughfare, but a down-up-down expedition across the Laurentian Hills. And it was not a gradual 130 meters rise and fall, but up and down and down and up and flat and then some more up and down. Again, the earth is not an even shape. Going from the heights of the Rideau Lake to the lows of the Ottawa Valley was not a challenge for the water itself. Since time immemorial, the water had been flowing along rivers deep and shallow, sprinting across rapids and jumping off waterfalls towards the rocky shoals below. This is fine for water, but boats can't do that. The solution to this was a series of locks. Canal locks were originally invented in China, but had since become more international and the engineering more refined. The locks were typically 3-chambered, but could be more if the difference between water levels is great. There is a central watertight chamber and 2 mitered chambers on either end, allowing access to the natural flows of the rivers. A ship going downriver would sail along the river, then enter into the first mitered chamber, then the gate would close. The downwater gate to the watertight central chamber would then gradually open up to allow the flood of water from the mitered chamber to fill the central chamber at a lower elevation than the upwater mitered chamber. Once the central and the mitered chamber have an equilibrium level, which is lower than the upriver, then the boat can then progress into the central chamber, where the gate is closed behind it, so the mitered chamber can refill again. The other end of the central chamber can then gradually open, allowing the water level therein to drop to the level of the river at the lower level. The boat can then sail into the lowered mitered chamber at the current level of the water and continue its journey to the lower level. Going upriver, the same process takes place, but in reverse. These locks have to be built very carefully. There needs to be enough room for the underwater part of a boat. The hull can have a draft of the shallowest part of the canal, and the shallowest lock or the shallowest river, which is 1.5 meters or about 5 feet. If a boat has a draw of 6 feet, it cannot navigate the Rideau Canal, as it would hit ground and be lost into the green depths forever, or until Parks Canada can send somebody to clear it. That was fine for light steamers and barges in the 19th century, but obviously not for the ocean-bound ships east of Montreal. Building a route from the Great Lakes to Montreal that would avoid the contested Saint Lawrence was such a good idea that it wasn't original to Parliament in 1826. It had been proposed and researched as early as 1783, and the project, in various forms, had been proposed on a fairly regular basis ever since. When funds were finally allocated, the project was formally undertaken, and an experienced military engineer, our friend from last week, Lieutenant Colonel John By, was given the task of realizing the proposal. Our last episode of this podcast was the life and times of John By, so I won't be dwelling on the person today, save to say that he was an experienced engineer with a history of working with explosives in the siege of Badajoz, during the Peninsular War against Napoleon, and as the director of a gunpowder factory north of London. He also had experience building and repairing canals in Canada, particularly along the Saint Lawrence, from the Les Couteaux to the Pointe Cascade. John By traveled the Atlantic to Canada, met with the Governor-General, George Ramsay, the Earl of Dalhousie. Being Scottish, he pronounced his name Dalhousie, not Dalhousie, like a Haligonian university, not Dalhousie, like the Niagara Peninsular Port north of St. Catharines, or the Ottawa Red Light Street of Dalhousie. Dalhousie. The S is pronounced S, not Z. By then inspected the Upper Canada side of the Ottawa, just downriver from the Chaudière Falls, and began to assemble a team to build the canal. Dalhousie made no secret of his intention to build the canal, which spurred the financial furtiveness of a man by the name of Captain John Le Breton. The canal was to begin at Richmond Landing, at what's now Le Breton Flats, and then cut across what's now Preston Street, down to Great Dow Swamp, now Dow's Lake, and continue along much as the canal is today. There would be the construction site, the labor camp, and whoever controlled that land would be able to charge rents to the military, the province, and the Crown, as well as have a monopoly on the services to the laborers. who would create a virtual city for the duration of the project. Le Breton bought the land from an absentee landlord and United Empire loyalist named Robert Randall and prepared to become a rich man as soon as construction began. Dalhousie was furious at Le Breton's get-rich-quick scheme, mostly angry that he thought of it before him, and in consultation with Colonel By, the site of the planned entrance to the Rideau Waterway was moved away from the flats of the avaricious Le Breton to what's now called Entrance Bay, though it was obviously not named that until construction began. Let Le Breton keep his swampland. The canal was to begin at Entrance Bay and wend through the countryside and farmland in the general direction of Dow's Swamp. Selling land to the Crown made the Vermont native Abraham Dow a rich man. Another prominent farmer and Massachusetts native, Bradish Billings, was unwilling to sell his land, and the canal was forced to circumnavigate his land on its way to Dow's. I'm mentioning these two names not only because the names are still written on the maps of those areas, but because they were pretty much the only families who lived along the Rideau until it would hit Burrett's Rapids. In addition to choosing the site, By began to assemble a staff. The general staff was important because this touches on the topic of how we know what we know about the canal's construction, and the general staff were those who wrote reports and kept journals during the 6 years of construction. Thomas Mackay was a master stonemason and engineer who would take responsibility for much of the practical materials construction of the canal. He would eventually go on to found his own community along the Ottawa, and he would name it New Edinburgh after his birthplace, and would probably be affronted at the modern pronunciation of New Edinburgh. Captain Thomas Burrows was a sapper and surveyor whose greatest contribution to the project was as an artist. His watercolors of the Rideau Canal are still found in municipal buildings in Ottawa, and most books that feature the Rideau Canal will host at least one or two of Burrows' sketches or paintings. The third significant staff member for us was Dr. A.J. Christie, who catalogued the injuries and maladies that befell the workers over the 6-year project. His journals survive to this day. Colonel By, Dalhousie, Mackay, and Burrows came to the Columbia Hotel and planned their camp for early spring. There they met local magnate Philman Wright, who assured them that not only could he and his sons supply By with all the lumber he needed, they could quarry stone and make cement. Getting it across the river would be a bit of an onerous duty, so they would build a bridge over the Ottawa to bring the materials to the base camp at Entrance Bay. In addition to the location of the first cut, where the Ordnance Office still stands, now the Bytown Museum, other sites nearby were identified for development as the project went forward. Entrance Bay lay at the bottom of a gorge between two hills. This would actually protect the location from the gale winds that typify Ottawa winters. Up the western slope of the gorge was a hill that the canal team would call Barracks Hill, where military equipment and ordnance would be stored. It's now called Parliament Hill and is home to the national legislature. The eastern slope ascended to a hill where By had a house built that would be home to he and his family for the next 6 years, giving that hill the name Colonel's Hill. It has since been demoted to Major's Hill and is home to a large park and the Chateau Laurier, one of Canada's great railroad hotels, even if the rail station moved away in 1966. Downriver, past Colonel's Hill, was a low-lying area where the laborers' camp would be built. This was the first settlement of what would become Lower Town. The laborers wouldn't trek up Colonel's Hill and then back down to the construction site at the base. They would ferry around the hill in shifts to get to work, so there were impromptu docks built to connect Lower Town and Entrance Bay. In addition to the ferry boat, there was also a road built from the hastily constructed Union Bridge to Barracks Hill. The Union Bridge was actually a series of 5 bridges over an archipelago on the river, now called Chaudière Crossing. This connected Philman Wright's warehouse to the Ordnance Warehouse on Barracks Hill, along the Richmond Road, now largely Wellington Street. All they needed now was the labor, and they'd be ready to start. That winter, Colonel By spent in Montreal recruiting. There were many experienced canal workers who had earned their stripes on the Saint Laurence, the Lachine, and other aqueducts. Many of the skilled tradesmen were Anglo-Irish, English, or Scottish. They were largely Protestant and had enough wealth that they needed to be tempted into moving upriver. The general laborers, however, unskilled as they were largely Irish Catholics and were tempted by the promise of regular pay and 2 square meals a day. French laborers were also used, more as lumbermen, felling trees and sawing lumber for use in the stoneworks that were more of the purview of the Irish. The laborers would be housed in the lower town camp, and the skilled tradesmen, foremen, and other artisans would be housed next to Barracks Hill along the Richmond Landing Road, in what would come to be known as Upper Town. None of these names were very imaginative. Remember that this is not a city. This is a labor camp. In spring of 1827, shovels started going into the ground, explosives into holes, quarried stone was placed inside, and locks were built to prepare for the flow of water. This first stretch of the canal was dry, remember. From Mooney's Bay and Hogsback Falls, 10 kilometers away, the Rideau River and the Rideau Canal were separate waterways. The construction had to be perfect, so that when the water broke at Hogsback, the canal would fill but not burst. Dow's Swamp would be converted into a lake to act as a reservoir and stabilizer for the flow down the Ottawa. Once the canal had reached the Rideau River at Mooney's Bay in the spring of the second year, the dam they constructed at Hogsback went into action, and the canal began to successfully fill, meaning that the laborers could travel by ferry from the docks at Lower Town to the work sites along the Rideau River. We should call that dam the first Hogsback Dam, because it was not the last. The first Hogsback Dam collapsed when packed frozen earth lost its integrity when the melts came. The Rideau River took its full strength back, and the Rideau Canal was dry again. Fortunately, nobody lived along the riverway, save Bradish Billings, so the human damage was not. Once the dam was rebuilt and stable, connection to the Rideau River was made. Boats could simply sail upriver without difficulty until Long Island, a name so ubiquitous that there are an estimated 273 other islands on this earth that share that name. Our Long Island is south of Barrhaven, technically Manotick. It was there that the locks needed to be built again to circumnavigate the rapids and manage the gradual ascension towards Rideau Lake. By the time the canal project stretched from Ottawa to Kingston, John By and his team had built 47 masonry locks and 52 dams. Most of the locks were built at small Loyalist settlements like Merrick's Rapids, modern Merrickville, Burritt's Rapids, still Burritt's Rapids, Smith's Falls, and Jones Falls. On 13 March 1832, the project was completed, and John By and his team were celebrated at the Carmino Hotel in Kingston. Regimental bands played. The Rideau Canal team were presented with what was described as the greatest meal in the history of Kingston. An inaugural cruise went up the canal to the Ottawa a few days later and arrived in Hull Township the following week. Working in the freezing cold of winter and the scorching heat of summer was the hardest on the laborers rather than the engineers and officers. One got the bruises and the other got the honors, but the distinction was ignored by the tiny mosquitoes that pestered the rich and poor alike. At both ends of the Rideau Waterway, there are Celtic crosses, erected to commemorate the deaths of approximately 1,000 Irishmen, not to be sexist, but the laborers were exclusively men, who died mostly from malaria, but also from explosions, construction accidents, exposure, and other misfortune. One of the issues of malaria, rather than the mortality rate, is the morbidity rate. If you get the bubonic plague, for example, you're healthy, you get infected, you get sick, you die, and that's the end of it. With malaria, you're healthy, you get infected, you get sick, you get better, and then you get sick again. And then this can repeat for years until the end of your life. Colonel By spent the last 2 years of his life mostly bedridden in England, which for a man of means was something that a family can endure. For the families that relied on the sweat of someone's brow, the recurring illness of malaria was the destruction of a family. When the project came to its conclusion, as all projects must, we move our focus back up to the northern end of this canal near Entrance Bay. There were thousands of people there now, mostly Irish labourers in the ramshackle lower town, but also some people who had established businesses catering to those labourers. Bars and brothels, clothiers and cobblers, the labour camp was developing into a town in its own right. Across the river was the more established Columbia Falls, but nobody called it that. They called it Wrightstown, after its most preeminent citizen, Filman Wright. The same naming convention emerged on the South Shore, as locals started calling their settlement Bytown, after their local chieftain. Bytown wouldn't officially incorporate as a town until 1 January 1850, but in the 24 years between then and John By's first arrival, it would gradually become a town by most practical definitions. Now that the canal was completed, at huge cost, that cost would need to be assessed. The military value of the canal was limited by the mutual demilitarization of the Great Lakes by Britain and the United States. Not everyone in London and Washington believed that this peace would hold. But here we are 200 years later, and it seems to be holding. So the military value of the canal was limited. Perhaps it contributed to the American reluctance to engage in another conflict on the Great Lakes, but there is no existing evidence to say so with any degree of confidence. The canal could also function as a civil project, assisting trade and commerce between the new settlement of Bytown and the other settlements in Upper Canada. This could have moved the Ottawa River colony into the Upper Canada economy, instead of being simply another orbit of Montreal in Lower Canada. This would have some validity for the next 20 years, until 1852 when the Bytown and Prescott Railway begins operations, moving people and goods faster and cheaper between the Ottawa and the Saint Laurence. While I'll be the first to admit that the Rideau Canal is pretty, at an equivalent cost in today's Canadian dollars of $223,896,907.30, it's not that pretty. It can't really be called worth the investment of capital. But it's now a part of the history, heritage, and culture of the city of Ottawa. And I'm not comfortable putting a price on cultural value. It's certainly cheaper than many of the wars in which Canadians fought and died and can now no longer remember. It's certainly more valuable than many other projects designed to create a sense of shared culture. And it gives Ottawa something, even today, that I'm glad is there, although I understand the rage of British paymasters at the time. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening to this episode of the Ottawa History Hub podcast. I'd appreciate it if you could take a moment to leave a positive review or a 5-star click on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you find this podcast. Please give me a follow on Facebook or Blue Sky at Ottawa History Hub or on Twitter X as Ott History Hub. Next week, we'll be checking in on the Algonquin again in the form of the Rideau Purchase, which is a pair of treaties that has governed relations between the Crown and the Indigenous people of the area ever since. Until then, advance Ottawa, en avant!